The world is too much with us, laments the English poet William Wordsworth. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. He goes on to say that not only have we lost all harmony with the natural world, we have also become hardened to the things that matter most in life. For everything we are out of tune, he says. It moves us not, great God. As it happens, Wordsworth wrote these lines nearly 2 centuries ago, in 1805. But they could have been penned any day last week. Everything seems out of tune. The U.S. economy, like the economies of most advanced nations, has once again entered the danger zone. The increasingly acute sovereign debt crisis in Europe threatens to tear apart the Eurozone. Set against the backdrop of seismic shifts in the Arab world, some doubtless for better, some perhaps for worse, the showdown at the United Nations over Palestinian statehood seems like a high-stakes gambit indeed. Here at home, the execution of Troy Davis calls into question our commitment to being a republic where, as our Pledge of Allegiance puts it, we ensure liberty and justice for all. And the principal conversation among those who wish to be our next president is whether turning back the clock 80 years is sufficient, or whether a reversion to an earlier period of civilization would be even better. We are out of tune. With what are we out of tune, you may ask? Many of our experiences are out of tune with our ideals. The ideal of democracy gives the power to govern not to those who have been ordained by God, or to those who have inherited a title, or to those who have amassed a fortune, but to each and every citizen. But when the majority of citizens feels politically impotent and economically fearful, democracy becomes another name for the political manipulation of the many to serve the interests of the few. We are out of tune. The ideal of capitalism gives people the right to own the fruit of their own labor and thereby choose their own way of life. But as economic systems become more complex and financial disparities become more magnified, capitalism becomes another name for the economic deprivation of the many for the benefit of the few. We are out of tune. The ideal of justice is that a neutral standard applies to the actions of everyone, regardless of social standing or economic circumstances or gender or sexual orientation or religion or race. The law is that neutral standard, at least it's supposed to be, but sometimes it's not. Troy Davis is dead because he was not wealthy and white like Dominique Strauss-Kahn. I'm not saying that Davis was innocent or that DSK was guilty, but enough evidence suggests that DSK might have committed a crime and Troy Davis might not have, that the disparity in outcomes looks, to me at least, like a travesty of justice. We are out of tune. William Wordsworth knew well the sounds of a world out of tune, a world filled with peril but also with possibility. Born in 1770 in England, he moved to France at age 19, 1789, and became a champion of the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. He began writing poems about subjects previously considered unworthy of attention by poets, such as the world of nature and the experience of people who had been marginalized by society. This focus on experience rather than reason became the hallmark of Romanticism, a movement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries of which Wordsworth was the leading poet. Romanticism was a reaction against the rationalism of the Enlightenment. After the Enlightenment had wrested truth from the clutches of the Church, many thinkers followed Immanuel Kant, who insisted that truth could be found only through the deductions of reason and the inquiries of science. Romantic philosophers and poets formed part of a backlash against the view that reason could solve all problems and fulfill all dreams. Instead, they emphasized feeling and immediate experience. They focused on inner passions and struggles. Where did Wordsworth go when the world was too much with him? He went for a walk in the sublimely beautiful Lake District in northern England. Holly and I were fortunate enough to be able to do the same for several days earlier this week, after helping Zoe move into her dorm at the University of St. Andrews. With our goodbyes still echoing, I was feeling bereft, not to mention battered by the headlines. The Lake District, with its blend of pastoral beauty and daunting ruggedness, was a perfect place to wrestle with a world out of tune. For his part, Wordsworth took a walking tour of the Lake District in 1799 with his friend Samuel Coleridge, who also became a leading Romantic poet. They came upon a former pub that was available for rent. Wordsworth fell in love with Dove Cottage, as he called it, and soon thereafter moved into the cottage with his sister Dorothy. They were joined by Mary Hutchinson several years later, when she and William married. Over the next 7 years, William and Mary would have 5 children together. Both Dorothy, his sister, and Mary, his wife, contributed substantially to William's poetry, and not just by raising the children and doing the housework, which they did. Dorothy became an estimable poet in her own right, and her journals provided William with evocative descriptions of the natural world around them, like the fields of daffodils that became his most famous poem. And Mary, his wife, served as his scribe. William composed while walking out of doors. And we have since learned that Mary contributed some of his most memorable lines. The decade at Dove Cottage would prove to be the happiest years of the Wordsworth's life and his most productive years as a poet. In his mind, Dove Cottage and the exquisitely beautiful countryside around it were supremely important, because they were first and foremost a source of the kind of experience that Wordsworth valued most. He insisted that experiences can only happen when a particular place makes them possible. He was right. This particular place, All Souls, makes certain experiences possible that are hard to find elsewhere. In one of his poems, Wordsworth tries to describe the elusive allure of Dove Cottage in the Lake District. He writes, "I cannot name it. 'Tis the sense of majesty and beauty and repose, a blended holiness of earth and sky, something that makes this individual spot, this small abiding place of many souls, a termination and a last retreat, a center, come from where'er you will, a whole without dependence or defect, made for itself and happy in itself, perfect contentment, unity entire." At its best, the experience of the Lake District, or any place of beauty and repose, isn't only an escape from the dissonance of the world, its brutality and its brokenness. In fact, Holly and I took our feelings of loss and the turmoil of the morning's headlines with us, alongside every ancient stone wall, through every meadow strewn with sheep, and atop every crest and crag. Just because the walk is lovely doesn't mean your daughter hasn't left home or the markets aren't in turmoil. But it does mean that not everything is out of tune. In the blended holiness of earth and sky, we experienced a center, a place of fragile wholeness, perhaps even a fleeting sense of happiness. Wordsworth needed such a place because he experienced firsthand life's harsh brutality. William and Dorothy's younger brother drowned in 1905. Soon thereafter, Coleridge's increasingly erratic behavior from his opium addiction led William to abandon their long-standing and much-treasured friendship. In 1812, 2 of William and Mary's children died, including 3-year-old Catherine, William's favorite among the children. Throughout these losses, bitter, painful, wrenching, William refused to retreat from the immediacy of his experience. Several years after Catherine died, he wrote a poem about a moment when he wanted to tell her something. He writes, "Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, I turn to share the transport, oh, with whom but thee, deep buried in the silent tomb? Have I been so beguiled as to be blind to my most grievous loss? That thought's return was the worst pang sorrow ever bore, save one only, when I stood forlorn, knowing my heart's best treasure was no more, that neither present time nor years unborn could to my sight that heavenly face restore.